Hi, I'm Doug Draper with Acme Distribution and the Denver Transportation Club, and I'm pleased to present our series, Supply Chain and Logistics, the Storytellers. This series is brought to you by Cap Logistics. Cap Logistics, they're experts offering you customized transportation solutions for all of your needs, so please visit at caplogistics.com. All right, so today's topic is about fuel and its impact on the supply chain. And we're excited to have our guest here, Michael Webb with Petrol Alchemy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
It's great. So we talk about transportation and logistics and things moving on trucks and equipment, but the one thing that is universal in all of those is fuel and oil. You know, things have to keep them moving along. So this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about fuel, not necessarily trends, but some new technology that's coming out that your company has developed that'll really impact things in the future, and specifically 2020 with some new things that are coming around with some rules and regulations we'll get into a little bit later. But first and foremost, again, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your business and how you kind of got into this industry.
Well, first of all, the whole notion of storyteller, I think, is perfect.
Oh, great.
And the whole item about petrol, in our case, petrol is typically in the UK short for gasoline.
Okay.
So when they talk about petrol, it's the energy source that they use. And for us, the second piece is probably the most important, and that's the alchemy. And if you go back, especially in the Middle Ages, most of the science, at least in the chemistry side, came out of these quote-unquote people that were alchemists.
Okay.
And what alchemy was back then is taking something of a base element and converting it to a much higher value product. So one of the things that the alchemists were known for is trying to convert lead to gold.
How'd that work out for them?
A lot of unintended consequences, but it turned out very, very well, actually.
Okay.
You know, it's even though they were chasing the wrong idea, this whole item about how can we do an elemental configuration that's different that will change the nature of the product. Mm-hmm. And so when we came up with the name Petrol Alchemy, it was to do exactly that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's great. How long has your business been around?
7 years.
Okay.
7 years.
And are you the founder and everything with the business?
I am.
Excellent.
I am.
Good deal.
Hence why I know so much about the name.
Yeah. No, you know, like you said, storytellers and the backstory of
Yes.
everything is important. So, so tell us a little bit about the business itself, right? So we get kind of the origins and the genesis of it, but in 2018, like what exactly does your company do?
Well, one of the areas that we're an intellectual property-based company,
Okay.
which means we use, in our case, patents. And we have a patent that takes used motor oil or crude motor oil, and we actually bring those together in our own process, which is very different from a refinery process, into what we call reformulation.
Okay.
And reformulation allows us to take, I'll just specifically pick used motor oil, and convert it directly into high-value products such as JP8 jet fuel.
Okay. So is there a lot of you talked about low value and high value. So when I think of oil, I'm thinking up in the Bakken Basin and
Mm-hmm.
you're just cranking out more oil than you can possibly do. But it sounds like there's a decent amount that is not refinable or it's dirty or tell me more about that.
Well, one of the constraints is about how much capacity we have to do refining. And we talked about what's going to happen in January of 2020 with global regulations. Mm-hmm. And part of it is the ocean-going vessels use real low-value fuel. In fact, they use, what we typically call sub-bunker fuel. And so, bunker oil is the stuff, it's at the bottom of the refinery
Okay.
areas, and it's what they usually clean out, and it's things that they have no other use for because it is so low value. And the problem with bunker oil is it has laden fuel, which is primarily composed of sulfur content. Sulfur content allows, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide,
Sure.
tremendous environmental issues that adds to the pollution, incredibly so. And one of the studies actually indicated that the three largest of these super tankers we hear of
Yes.
actually produced more environmental hazard out the stacks than all of the automobiles combined in terms of the sulfur dioxide. Yeah, it's I'll put it to you this way. If the entire globe of different countries agree on one thing and how they have to control that regulation because of the environmental damage that it's doing, it's a big issue.
Yeah. You never see the steamship line. It's in the ocean, and so, perception's reality, and we sit in traffic every day, and so you say this is the problem. You don't see the problem in the steamship line as it's coming across. So I completely understand that, and your perspective is a good example. So,
Well, if you ever get on eBay and you buy something that's relatively inexpensive and say $10 and it's coming from China, and that includes free shipping, the reason why it's free shipping is because the low price of fuels at this point before January 2020. And when January 2020 rolls around, the sulfur content goes down incredibly so, down to less than 5%, and in this case, it's 0.5% of sulfur.
that's the new regulation?
That's the new regulation. So, if you think about it comparatively, here's what's going on today. Here's what has to happen in 2020. It's a tremendous drop.
Is there any wiggle room? May be the wrong, but sometimes here's when it starts, and you get a 6-month grace period. Have they thought about that? Is that in the plan?
They've thought about it, and I think everybody who knows kind of environmental regulations know that when something that is that dramatic, there will be, some level that has to be mitigated. But in this case, what happens is if you think about the bunker oil that's being produced and used today, and then we have to go to this low sulfur content. One of the big issues is, do we have refining capacity to be able to produce the very low sulfur content? That's the problem. It's not the oil, it's the type of oil that has to be done that switches to the refinery capacity, and therein lies the problem.
In your model, is the technology that Petrol Alchemy has come up with, is that refining done like literally before it goes into the vessel, or is it being refined at a different location and before it even moves through the pipe chain, if you will, it's already refined? Like, when does that happen?
For our technique, in our patents, what we do is we bypass all of the refining process. And we can take used motor oil, and what we do, if in refineries, they typically run, and this is different by each refinery, but somewhere around 800 degrees Fahrenheit in temperature, and anywhere from 1,200 to 1,600 pounds per square inch pressurization. Our process, since we don't do refining, we do reformulation.
Okay.
So when you talk about the things that we're doing, it's all in regards to reformulation. And we run 230 degrees Fahrenheit and 0 pressurization. Yeah, so it's a totally different view. And it starts with the definitions. If you think about refining, not just oil, but the term refining,
Right.
it usually means to take out impurities. Reformulation, we don't do that. What we do is we reorder all of the chemistry. We add catalysts and we add organic amino acids into the formula so that we completely bypass all of the refinery and we change the chemistry of the fuel. So when we go from used motor oil to directly to something which is on the continuum of kerosene-based fuels, one of the highest is JPA jet fuel.
Okay.
And we can convert directly from something negative, like used motor oil, directly into a high-value fuel, such as JPA jet fuel.
Interesting. So you're not, like you said, you're not pulling out impurities. You're literally changing the chemical base. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
That's exactly right.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
So I think from a supply chain perspective, what's so fascinating about this is it's truly changing everything. So the foundation of what we know today, if I am an importer into the United States, if I am involved in supply chain in any way, I'm currently thinking about bunker fuel prices, GRIs that come out,
Sure.
and I'm trying to balance my budget for the next 5 years. What are my total landed costs so that I can continue to sell at margins that are going to be important to me as an organization? What's going to happen is that's not how the game is going to be played even moving forward. And this comes as early as 2020. And so what's fascinating to me is that it's amazing that we've got Michael in here to talk about the science in terms of the technology and how there are now new technologies taking us forward. And so I want to dive into that a little bit as well. But secondly, if I am in supply chain, I mean, it's really an important issue. And if you're not knowledgeable of this issue, you need to become educated in this issue because it will drastically, both from a pricing perspective and just in terms of how supply chains move and flow, become critical to your business if you're shipping globally in the world moving forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. For those of you, Bonnie, that was not Michael's voice. Bonnie Chacon with the Cap family. She came in to join us, so thank you very much. So we talked about the impacts of the supply chain, which is, the focus of our storytellers. So what does that do for the general consumer, right? So you described my 16-year-old daughter's closet with low, inexpensive items from China. So the technology that you're bringing to the table, how is that going to impact the cost? Is what you're talking about more expensive than refining? Is it the same? Is it less? And then obviously the regulations in 2020, how does that all play around financially to the end consumer?
There's two parts. One is the total cost of ownership. And so the cost to actually process using the reformulation is dramatically lower than a refinery.
Okay.
To give you some idea, logistics was center to our strategy of why we started to process Petrol Alchemy the way that we did. And here's a few examples. We can take our entire reformulation process, put it on the back of a 40-foot trailer. I'd like to see anybody try to do that.
Right.
With a
refinery.
With a refinery.
Yeah.
And of course the volumes are going to be lower, but part of our strategy was if you go to where the oil is and you produced a final product at that point, then distribution goes to where the value-added customers are. So we don't have to get something in North Dakota, ship it down to Houston, get it refined, ship it to distribution points, and then go from there. So it's a tremendous constriction of the logistical supply chain. And you're always trying to shorten your supply chain anytime you possibly can to lower the cost. So, the two questions you asked me, one is about what does that mean to people? Our costs are dramatically, when I say dramatically, I mean more than 50% less than a refinery cost. The other thing that we looked at was the impact that we have environmentally. So most of the refineries, based on their age, and by the way, most of the refineries today were originally constructed over 40 years ago.
Wow.
So there's tremendous repair issues. They continuously upgrade, but when you build a refinery, you have to build to the endpoint capacity, build to the max.
Sure.
With ours, one of the things that we tried to do, and my background is I worked a long time for the Toyota Group, is that we look for modularity. So that
tell me, what does that mean?
Modularity means that instead of building to the maximum, we can build and add more modules if we need to increase the capacity. Or if you're doing changeovers like they do in a refinery, something goes down. Usually it's the refinery.
Sure.
In our case, say we're just doing 100 million gallons. We can have a 50 million gallon unit, two 20s, and a 10. So it's like making change.
Right. It's a good analogy.
Yeah, it is. One of the good things about having that is tremendous flexibility. So if you think about the potential of having accidents, for instance, since we don't do pressurization, and if you cook on your stove, the difference between trying to make soup so that it's at 800 degrees versus 200 degrees.
Right.
The amount of energy that's there to raise the temperature of liquids, that's one of the cost advantages that we have. And then the pressurization is also one of the cost advantages that we have. And then when you combine both pressurization and high temperatures, what do you think that does for the safety issues?
Skyrockets.
That's why when they have an accident at a refinery, it's not a good thing. And since we're at a much lower, we're 75% lower in the temperature range, and we have no pressurization, the safety issues go down dramatically.
Right.
And then for the environmental pieces, one of the, things that happen as an outcome of our process is that when you look at Commerce City, when we go by there,
Sure.
Not too far from here, you smell it before you see it.
Yeah.
And that's not a good thing. In fact, they're proving out what the health hazards are located within a radius of the refinery.
Gosh.
So in our process, it's just the opposite. The only thing we produce is pure oxygen. So instead of producing, sulfur-related compounds or, carbon dioxide compounds, we're producing pure oxygen as an outcome of our process, which uses an ozonation process. It's an oxygen enrichment process. So after we go through the ozonation, what we have left is pure oxygen that goes in the atmosphere, and oxygen is a scavenger. So it's what you want to have.
Right. Very interesting. So in your business, you have the intellectual property that you mentioned out of the gate. Does your company also get involved with making the equipment that provides the reformulation, or are you just selling and consulting on companies to actually build the equipment to do this?
The latter. We're not builders. We're far more on the intellectual property side. And so, as you're speaking, one of the strategic partners that we're looking for is someone that has the oil field experience and oil field services competency that we do not have. We only build our test versions, and that's what we do.
Gotcha. Have you found, obviously we can't get into names and specifics yet, but have you found companies that have embraced it and said, hey, this makes sense to me and we're going to invest in the infrastructure, if you will, to build this?
No. I'd like to say we have. We have not at this point in time, though we have some very likely suitors.
That's great. Are the suitors primarily in the oil and gas industry?
Yes.
Is there, I know we talked about oil and gas and the fuel for trucks and vessels and steamship lines. Are there other industries that have application for this? Would I, as a consumer, ever put oil in my car that would be from this process, or is it not quite far down to that level?
You wouldn't put oil. You may put in diesel. It's a fuel and not so much a constituent of the fuel. But yes, you could do something like that. And the difference is when we run crude motor oil. In crude motor oil, the sulfur hasn't been depleted.
Okay.
Used motor oil, it has. So when you go to pull out your dipstick, you notice it's black on the dipstick, and you can smell it on the dipstick. That's a lot of the compounds that have been depleted in the used motor oil, and as it depletes, it loses its lubricity ability. And that's the reason why you change oils.
Got it. I understand. A lot of big words I'm trying to get my hands around. I'm really focused on what you're saying.
Okay, so right, absolutely. When you hear these words, it can be a lot to take in, and I think a majority of our listeners are thinking to themselves, how does this change potentially affect me as an individual or affect my company? And so some of the customers that we've started to identify is first and foremost is the steamship line, and we can revisit that. So they've got regulation coming into play that they're going to have to adhere to, and the impact of that is, of course, I think the statistic is high as 90% of the world's goods at some point are being shipped and moved by a steamship line. So when you think about that, the implication of what this regulation coming in 2020 means on a global scale is just enormous. So you've got the steamship lines. What does that mean for me as an importer here in the United States? If I'm a buyer and I import my tennis shoes or my computers, what does that mean for me? And I think that's a segment where we can discuss a little bit more, because initially, if the manufacturing units themselves to reformulate the fuels are not currently under development on a mass scale, but yet we've got regulation coming up ahead of us in just a short period of time that is going to require mass production of such units, that there's going to be a shortage. Absolutely, there's going to be a supply chain shortage of that sort of equipment. And with that being said, whenever demand outstrips supply, those costs then go through the roof. So my expectation would be that both for steamship lines, me as a buyer of an importer, and then ultimately as an ultimate consumer, I would have to anticipate that the cost of goods is going to go skyrocketing here in a few short years directly as a result of that until manufacturing capabilities match up. Am I on the right track there?
100%. 100%.
That's interesting. So we talked a little bit about the impacts to the consumer and the regulation that's coming out in 2020. Is that just specific to the steamship lines, or is that, I'm trying to get my hands around, is this a worldwide type of regulation that's coming out? Is it specific to maritime? Is it a U.S. regulation? Tell me more about that.
It is a global issue
and
global regulation, so everybody's going to be impacted.
Very interesting. So,
one of our first potential customers that contacted us several years ago was the ports on the West Coast. They saw what was coming. They wanted to get ahead, and they started placing orders so that they could actually process it on the port itself.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, it's been great. I look forward to talking a little bit more about it. The beauty about this is we have another segment. So we learned about it. Let's dive in a little bit more. So we look forward to it. We'll be right back. Thank you. Hey, welcome back. I'm Doug Draper with Acme Distribution and the Denver Transportation Club, and this is the Storytellers. We're here with Michael Webb with Petrol Alchemy and Bonnie Chacon with the Cab Worldwide Families. Thank you again for joining us. So when we were off air a minute ago, being storytellers, we've had a tremendous amount of stories, and you told one that was real specific here to Colorado about dirty oil. So let's just start. Tell us again about that story.
For any dirty oil, there's a huge problem. And less than half of all of the used motor oil is accounted for. And it's a strong pollutant. Have you ever put anything like oil into a pond? 500 milliliters of used motor oil will pollute a 10-acre pond.
Wow.
So part of what we're trying to do is also make it worthwhile economically to make use of the used motor oil.
Gotcha. Yeah, we were saying if you could put one of these stations down in Highlands Ranch, there's a lot of used oil that could be protected. So
Absolutely.
yeah. So let's switch gears and talk a little bit about education, because this is some cutting edge technology and there is some science and chemistry involved with it. So talk about some of the academic institutions that you've been involved with, or some of the programs that you've seen out there that's getting the next generation of not only logisticians, but just people that want to get into this industry. So talk about the educational aspect and some groups that you've been involved with that are kind of setting the stage for the type of people that would take this to the next level.
Number one is people who have a strong drive for curiosity. And in fact, some of the characteristics we look for people within our own organization is how fast can they learn, because this changes all the time. I was on the board at Colorado State for the Global Leadership Council, and it was a group of 40-some CEOs. And one of the things that we found out, and this is really important, is that when we actually asked the students that we were doing things with, in this case happened to be the College of Business, we asked them, what's the most important thing for you? Meeting with all of these senior executives. And we thought for sure they were going to say things like finding internships, finding jobs.
Yeah.
None of that was the primary driver. And so when we asked them what was the primary driver, they said spending time with people like you. So we understand the questions you ask, how do you lead, all of those kinds of issues. And believe it or not, the ones that usually perform the best are usually the ones that are driven to succeed for other reasons. It's not because of their education. So when you take a look at the kind of genesis of how we actually designed Petrol Alchemy, what we did is we used software. And the software we co-developed with the 3M company. And one of the things we looked at was how do you drive innovation? And one of the things we learned is every single innovative product that was developed had one common characteristic. They were connected through disparate types of fields. I'll give you a quick example. For automotives, it wasn't until they developed an internal combustion engine in Manchester, England, and one of the people that looked at that to make this connection was Standard Oil. And back in those days, in the early 1900s, Standard Oil was in business to produce one thing, kerosene. And they used it for heating, lighting, cooking. The problem with producing kerosene, they kept running into this aromatic exhaust that went off, and the exhaust could be liquid. And one of the things that they found, and this is the reason why they located next to waterways for the refineries, it was a thing what we call now gasoline. And it was the bane of their existence.
Really?
Well, if you think, what's gasoline good for? If you don't have an internal combustion engine, gasoline doesn't do a whole lot. And so one of the things that happened is that, Mr. Rockefeller with Standard Oil, one of the things he was renowned for is he would take all of these subscriptions to different global newspapers and look for what was happening else in the world. And so he made the connection between something that had no value, in fact, it had negative value, which was gasoline, and he married it up with an internal combustion engine on a horseless carriage that produced the automobile.
Interesting.
So we use that same technology that we developed with 3M in order for us to be able to identify some of these new abstracts that were coming out of the U.S. PTO, the Patent and Trade Office. But they come out so fast you don't have the time to read them all. And that's where we identified this, because we were looking at specific patents that were done by someone that we could see the end product, but they had no way to commercialize the product. So that's how we started, with the whole area of what we're doing with Petrol Alchemy. So when you think about different things like STEM, it's really important to have some background. It's more important to be creative.
That's a good way to put it.
So for us, when we look for people, that helps us build the next Petrol Alchemy, which we have a series of, by the way, we look for creative people. And we can work with people using tools like relevance logic, which is the software. And we can have people come in directly, working in high schools, etc. Because what we find out is typically the curious mind hasn't been pre-formatted yet by going through all of the standards and issues of college. Not that college is bad. I'm just saying it's a very different view of what can happen. And what you're seeing in the universities, and it's the same model that Petrol Alchemy is using, decentralization. It used to be you would go to different universities because that's where the knowledge was. Well, the Webb has changed all that. And so that's the reason why we talk about the characteristics of what we want to do, which is the rapid absorption of new knowledge and putting that together in unique ways.
Yeah, well, you talked about the innovators and then the early adopters.
Yes.
And then to take it to the general public, you need the type, not only well-educated students in STEM type of businesses, but that are creative.
Oh, absolutely.
And take it to the next level. That's great. So, again, off air, we were talking about 2020. That's a date that stuck with me, and we talked about things are changing in 2020, and I was confused on, okay, well, who's in charge of that, and what's the regulatory entity that's really focusing that change? And Bonnie, you could talk a little bit more about that. I'm like, okay, is it just a decision that we all agreed upon, or tell us more about that change and why that date and who's doing it?
So countries participate in the UN International Maritime Organization, and they all come together, to direct policy and what's best, not only for their own countries but globally. Since at the end of the day, we really all share one planet, and so it's as a result of that that they agreed upon not only the sulfur content and what that regulation needs to look like, but actually the implementation date. And we were talking a little bit earlier that there isn't right now enough equipment, and how is everyone going to meet this regulation? I think it's pretty obvious to most that companies are going to fall short of that. And typically in that situation, then there's that pushback to the governing body to say, well, let's just move that date out a little bit.
Sure.
Or what are we going to do? And you spoke a little bit about that, 6-month implementation, or what's that going to look like? And they heard all sides and ultimately came back and said, no, we're not going to move that date. We're not going to make any changes. This is such a critical issue that we're going to stand firm, and we're going to let the markets pull everyone together and force the issue to get everyone on board. So as a result of that, this date's not going anywhere, and it's quickly approaching.
So there has to be some incentive for compliance, and if the date is what the date is, do you know, are there penalties involved? So, hey, I'm doing what I can, and I'm trying to make sure my steamship line is compliant, but I'm not going to make it. So what happens next?
There hasn't been a ton of information coming out in terms of penalties. I think the issue has not wanted to go necessarily that direction as much as let's keep everyone embraced. If you push back a date, then everybody just pushes back their implementation. Whereas if you keep the date, but say we're going to continue as countries and business partners to work together to make this date viable and real, and let's focus on getting us all on board, that's where the focus has been.
Got it.
From what I've seen.
Yeah.
One of the things I was reading on Twitter early this morning was I went to Maersk. Mm-hmm. Maersk is the world's largest shipping container company. Mm-hmm. And that was on their Twitter account this morning.
Really?
Oh,
all about the regulations.
I didn't know that. I read that.
And so, I was going through that. The fact that the world's largest company in terms of, ocean-going vessels has that on their Twitter page, trying to educate people is huge. Mm-hmm. And Maersk was also involved with what I think is the number one issue that's facing logistics, and that's cybersecurity. Maersk, actually, we know a lot about cybersecurity, and Maersk was indirectly hit last year, and it shut Maersk down. They weren't the target of the cybersecurity, but they got hit with collateral damage that did. And the reason why it meant something for us personally, having gone through that, is we had chemicals coming from China. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't receive those chemicals because of what happened. It was traveling on Maersk. And we couldn't get that, which put our production schedule behind. So if you think about, on the logistics side, there's two really important parts that we've always viewed, strategically with logistics. One is information flow, and one is material flow. Yep. Mm-hmm. And of the two, my own vote is the information flow is more important because you can't get the material flow unless you have it. In this case, it was because of all of the international regulations. So a lot of their ships were held at port because they couldn't move it. They didn't have, bills of lading, all those kinds of issues. Right. So when we're looking at logistics, one of the things that we're trying to build in fact we did, is cybersecurity. And for us, we couldn't find the kind of cybersecurity platform that would work well for us because logistics is the center hub of what we're about, both from the user side, delivery side, and the reason why we can locate specifically right where the oil is.
Right, yeah.
So for us, about 2.5 years ago, we did a partnership with Lloyd's of London on the cybersecurity piece because we couldn't find it. So we ended up spinning out another company that's currently one of the largest cybersecurity platforms to protect us. And it's also the reason why, we arranged to meet with CAP Logistics. We have a saying in our company. It goes like this. It's physically impossible to go faster than your supply chain. And that's a solid truth. So we are connecting with CAP Logistics strategically, both about the information flow, the material flow. So when we look at, the logistics we have to have with CAP, you need to build that in first.
Right.
And that's what we're doing together. So, as Bonnie said, we have the input side, all the supply side. We're doing all these different things. On the output side, we just took in a huge volume that we're going to be producing of that no sulfur diesel for the ports.
Right.
Well, how do you expect us to move that fuel unless we have a partner like CAP Logistics?
Right, yeah. Well, I think that one thing I've kind of come is that refining extends the supply chain where reformulation can shrink it. And one thing that I'm finally understanding is the mobility of the technology that you're talking about. Earlier in the segment, you spoke about taking oil from Canada down to Houston and refining it, where in your technology, you literally take that technology to the source. And so tell us more about the mobility of it, I think, and the implications of what that is in a positive effect. question makes sense.
It does. And we're working now with one of the largest Japanese companies, and one of their divisions does mining.
Mm-hmm.
And mining, by definition, is in a remote location.
Yeah.
So one of the issues that we're talking about is how can they repurpose their used motor oil? The fact that they've used it for all of their mining equipment, but now they have to, remove it and pay to ship it out.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to pay to ship in fuel. So we said, well, why don't we do something simultaneously?
Yeah.
Like we reprocess, we reformulate your used motor oil and provide you with fuel. So you save a lot of cost on both sides of the equation.
When you reformulate it at the site there, using your example, don't ship it out to deal with it, keep it right there. Can they use it immediately?
They do.
Gotcha. How long does that process take? So I'm out in the mine and I used all this oil and it's dirty. Reformulating and I'm using it again. Is that days, hours, weeks? How does that work?
It's between 6 and 8 hours.
Wow.
So, it's a regular processing, and it's like anything else. You want it to be a continuous process to make it more efficient.
Yeah. So you shorten the supply chain. You've been able to reformulate and reuse. The technology isn't quite as expensive, and it's safer, right? So all those things, you start adding it up. It's got to mean that me or my daughter buying something over in China, it has to be less expensive. At least that's kind of what I'm thinking. I'm not sure if that is ultimately going to be the case or not. What are your thoughts?
I think the largest impact by far is the environmental impact.
Mm-hmm.
So versus, a refining process, we're able to produce out the back end, instead of being 77% efficient like most refineries are, we're in the mid-90s. So you're not producing anything negative. The thing that we produce is pure oxygen. Yeah. So everything we did when we designed this was meant to be environmentally cautious at first. We designed it into the process, and now we have an unbelievable low impact. And think about reprocessing any of the used motor oil. It's one less hole you got to dig.
Yeah.
To explore for more oil. So
yeah, it's pretty cutting edge. So my next question is, when's your IPO?
Doug, I want to take a moment, though, and go back to your question on costs. So if everything's so much more efficient and it's less expensive, one would then expect that costs are going to go down.
Yeah.
But
exactly. That's what I'm thinking right here. Like, this is great.
Right. And I wouldn't expect that. And here's why. If you just even, from an economic perspective, if you put this out there, since the demand originally is going to be so high, and the supply immediately out of the gate is going to be so low, you're going to have your costs go up quite a bit. Now, is that going to continue to be for 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10 years? It's all that's going to be dependent on how quickly the supply chain changes and the manufacturing of these units take place, and what that looks like. But really, organizations are predicting after 2020 increases on ocean freight going up as high as 85% as a result of the immediate supply-demand gap.
Is that simply going to be a bunker fuel surcharge that never goes away, or is it just because of all infrastructure involved, the rates are just going to go up and not come down? What are your thoughts there?
You're looking, and if you have more information, Michael, please feel free to speak to this. But really, it's going to be an overall rate. So right now, we're traditionally looking at, here's the cost to move a container, here's my bunker fuel price, and of course you have your GRIs throughout the year, and people get nervous on an extra $100. So we're talking, this blows that out of the water, right? I mean, 85% cost increase are substantial to any organization. So what you're looking at here is they actually have to purchase equipment, right, that would sit on the back of the steamship lines that's going to do the reformulation. So there's equipment costs that go up. So those are just hard asset costs that are going to drive up the base rate.
Yeah.
And then as far as the price of what is this fuel going to cost, I think that's probably something Michael could speak to. But initially, it's not going to be the cheapest fuel, right, because the demand is so high. 5 years, 10 years, what will that look like where it starts to bring everything back down into a reasonable space? At that point, I think the future is probably still out there a little bit. But
Yeah. So I was thinking other industries, right? So I make my widget over in China. All of a sudden, it's 85% more expensive on the transportation side. I naturally say, all right, I'm going to near source. I'm going to try to figure out how to make my widget in Canada or Mexico. So that leads me to my question is other industries, trucking and rail. Obviously, the steamship line is a huge target because of the amount of fuel and the exhaust and things. So talk to me about rail and trucking. So I just moved my operation to Mexico, and I'm going to avoid all that. Is there regulations that's going to come down to affect those modes? If that my question makes sense.
It does, and I'm not sure it's going to be regulatory driven as much as cost driven. So if you have a different type of fuel that could be at a much lower cost, you don't care. The principal reason why you're in business is to generate profit for your shareholders. If you can do that by buying and purchasing lower cost fuel, it runs just the opposite of raising prices and costs by 85%.
Interesting. Yeah. So doing that nearshoring, I think sounds like we may be safe for a little bit, where it won't necessarily impact us quite as much.
Well, it gets back to what President Trump talks about, is make energy independent from anyone else as a country. And so the fact that, we can do things like fracking and make it profitable, all of a sudden, and you're starting to see it now, we're the world's largest exporter. And all that's starting to change the base economics.
Interesting. That's good. That's great. Bonnie, do you have any comments on how changing the mode of transportation by near sourcing, going to rail or trucking, what are your thoughts on that?
I guess what I would say is that more now than ever, I see where supply chain industry and not necessarily the respect for those individuals that are in supply chain, but it is the industry that is so volatile right now. There's so much change, and there's so much that's going to be going on with it over the next decade, whether it be costs of fuel, technology changes in fuel, the cybersecurity, where are you going to source, what does that sourcing strategy look like? There is so much conversation to be had. And companies really need to be engaged. They need to start having those conversations. If they're not knowledgeable, they need to start to partner with people and educate themselves as to what does that look like. Because how you do business today, you need to be flexible and you need to be knowledgeable, and you're going to have to be doing business differently 5 years from now in order to stay viable. And that's a bigger conversation, I guess, of all of this.
Yeah, for sure. So 5 years out, business is different. 5 years out, what does your company look like?
Hopefully it'll be a lot larger. But it's one of the things that we're doing right now. The base patents that we have, we've actually learned to add much more value into those patents to elongate out. So right now we're in reformulation for oil. As part of that, we also have patents in developing long-chain carbon molecules. And so that's for all the petrochemicals. Right now it's used for rubber, plastics, pharmaceuticals, and it's very low chain level. We've just gone from 10 to 12 out of petrochemicals, and we're now exceeding 25,000 long-chain carbons. So we haven't even begun to explore that. But taking those long-chain carbons, we're now taking the next step into graphene, which is the future of material science. So we're always looking how we can extrapolate and add value into a base chemical process to continue the next series of products.
Yeah, the application.
And on that note, probably the next series of your storytelling. So
sure.
We'd love to have Michael back and continue on that conversation.
Absolutely. It's been terrific. Michael, I personally want to thank you because it is kind of a complex topic, and you did a phenomenal job today for guys like me just to kind of dumb it down and really get a handle on it. So you did an excellent job today. You've been a tremendous storyteller.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you so much. And thanks for joining us today on Connect and Collaborate Network, featuring the supply chain logistics, the storytellers. So thanks again, Bonnie. Appreciate you joining, and have a good day.
Thanks, Doug.
Bye.